alone!
Tonight, harrowing video showing a woman frantically running away from federal agents in Louisiana as President Trump's nationwide immigration crackdown intensifies.
Leave me alone!
Masked border agents chasing that woman on foot as she screams in fear.
Hey, so who you looking for?
Running into her house as her stepfather races outside, initially thinking she was being kidnapped, demanding answers. That woman was a 23-year-old U.S. citizen. DHS saying in a statement, all agents left the area as soon as they determined the individual in question was not who they were looking for. That incident comes after federal agents pulled this woman out of a car during a border operation in Florida as she screamed she was a U.S. citizen.
I'm a U.S. citizen! Please help me! This is unfair! Why are you doing this?
Watch those images again, because what you just witnessed is not an aberration or an accident, or even enforcement gone wrong, and you need to understand this in your bones right now, because this is the architecture of authoritarianism materializing in real time on American soil. Over a dozen United States citizens have been swept up in Trump's immigration crackdown, and that terrified 23-year-old woman running from federal agents screaming "Leave me alone" is exactly what the cruelty is designed to produce. Because fear and submission are the point when you understand that more than 80% of immigrants arrested in Washington during the federal surge had no prior criminal record, even though that crackdown was portrayed as targeting violent crime. And suddenly you realize this has nothing to do with public safety, and everything to do with the exercise of raw state power against brown bodies. These agents chasing this woman on foot as her stepfather races outside thinking she's being kidnapped are operating in a system moving faster and with fewer safeguards. And when you see that second woman yanked from a car in Florida screaming, "I'm a U.S. citizen, please help me. This isn't fair, why are you doing this to me?" You are watching the collapse of due process. You are watching the Fourth Amendment die in broad daylight, and Homeland Security's response is not remorse but defiance, because they refuse to apologize. They insist this is justified enforcement even when citizens are wrongly targeted and detained, and this is the tell, this is how you know we have crossed a threshold from which there may be no return. Now here comes the absolutely devastating part that should shake you to your core, and I need you to really grasp the scale of what's happening, because ProPublica found at least 170 United States citizens detained or arrested, though it was likely an undercount, and dozens if not hundreds of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents have been detained or arrested, and sometimes held for days, as Trump's immigration dragnet expands to more cities, and the lawyer representing these citizens says what's happening is simple. The Latino community, especially those with darker skin, who speak Spanish, listen to Spanish music, are being racially profiled. They stop, they detain people, sometimes arrest them, detain them for days, and then ask questions later, which is the textbook definition of racial profiling, and a constitutional violation so egregious that it should trigger immediate federal investigations, except the Department of Homeland Security says allegations that agents racially profile are disgusting, reckless, and categorically false, which is gaslighting on an industrial scale when you have a July raid at a cannabis farm in California, where George Ritez, a disabled U.S. citizen and veteran, was pepper-sprayed, tear-gassed, forcibly dragged from his vehicle, and held without explanation, legal counsel, or basic necessities for 3 days before being released without charges. And this is happening while ICE arrests roughly 1,100 people per day in recent weeks, chasing a Trump administration goal of 3,000 arrests daily. And when you understand that the majority of people arrested don't have another criminal violation, despite the administration constantly highlighting the worst of the worst, you begin to see this for what it actually is, which is an ethnic cleansing dressed up in the language of law enforcement. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and I need you to stay with me through this next part, because the trauma is not theoretical, it is measurable, and it is destroying communities right now, as a U.S. citizen named Javier Ramirez still wakes up in the middle of the night gasping for breath, pumping his fists into the air, as if fighting off an attacker 5 months after being tackled and arrested by immigration agents, and he still feels that fear that it might happen again just for looking Mexican or Latino. And another woman, Andrea Velez, says she still has trouble going outside by herself because they could come at any moment and just attack you again. And these are American citizens living in a state of terror in their own country. And when you see that on the first school day after immigration agents flooded Charlotte, more than 30,000 students, about 20% of district enrollment, were absent because families were too terrified to leave their homes, you are witnessing the psychological warfare component of state violence that extends far beyond the immediate targets and The LA Unified School District Superintendent says these declines reflect a climate of fear and instability created by ongoing immigration crackdowns, which disrupt family stability, housing, and mobility. And when families are afraid to be seen or cannot afford to remain, they are less likely to re-enroll, or stay in public schools, which means Trump's deportation machine is now actively interfering with children's constitutional right to education, because that's what fascism does. It makes the exercise of basic rights dangerous. Here's where the legal architecture gets absolutely chilling. And this is the smoking gun that proves intentionality, because a federal judge found that DHS adopted a policy requiring only reasonable suspicion rather than probable cause for both unlawful presence and escape risk. And this conclusion is based on repeated public statements by senior DHS officials, including Border Patrol Commander Gregory Bovino, explicitly stating that warrantless arrests required only reasonable suspicion, which is a deliberate and systematic lowering of constitutional standards. And a federal judge, late Tuesday, blocked the Trump administration from making widespread immigration arrests in the nation's capital without warrants or probable cause that the person is an imminent flight risk, granting a preliminary injunction, because even judges appointed across the political spectrum can see this is lawless. But here's the most revealing part. DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin responded by saying, "Allegations that DHS law enforcement engages in racial profiling are disgusting, reckless and categorically false, and worse, smears like those are driving an 1,150% increase in assaults on ICE officers and the 8,000% increase in death threats against them, which is the classic move of authoritarian regimes, blaming criticism for violence rather than acknowledging that agents of the state operating without constitutional constraints might generate legitimate resistance, and when a judge in Chicago has already ordered 600 people released because they were arrested without a warrant, with more releases possible." You understand that we are talking about systemic illegality happening at scale across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Now let me pull back the curtain on what this actually represents in the broader architecture of MAGA authoritarianism, because when you see that Trump's latest immigration crackdown, prompted by the shooting of National Guard members, means he has now halted or significantly tightened every legal and illegal form of foreign entry into the U.S., prompting widespread fear and confusion among immigrants, unsure what will happen to their pending cases. And there were more than 2.2 million immigrants waiting for asylum decisions or hearings as of end of August, and DHS is reviewing all asylum decisions made during Biden's term, and the halt means asylum seekers who might already have waited years for their cases now face an even more uncertain future. You are watching the deliberate creation of a permanent underclass of millions of people, with no legal status, no recourse, and no protection, living in a state of perpetual fear, which is precisely the condition necessary for labor superexploitation and political disenfranchisement. And when DHS says citizenship is a privilege, not a right, and we will take no chances when the future of our nation is at stake, they are explicitly rejecting the foundational principle that rights inhere in personhood, not in state permission, which is the cornerstone of every authoritarian ideology ever constructed. But here's the part that should terrify you most about where this leads, and I'm going to be very direct because the historical parallels are unavoidable when the existence of a large group of people with a shared political identity and a shared belief that political violence is justified creates a climate of acceptance, if not encouragement, for political violence, and raises the risk that it will occur. And research shows that MAGA Republicans are substantially more likely than others to endorse statements of authoritarianism, including a call to suspend Congress for a few years, and the assertion that having a strong leader for America is more important than having a democracy, and in the view of many experts that preference may have been realized via the democratic process in 2024, with the U.S. facing a real risk of transition to authoritarianism in 2025. We are not talking about policy disagreements. We are talking about a movement that has explicitly abandoned democratic norms and embraced violence as a political tool. And when you understand that left-wing violence has risen in the last 10 years, particularly since Trump's rise to political prominence in 2016, and more contentious politics in the United States, and the expansion of the Make America Great Again movement, appear to have re-energized violent left-wing extremists, what you're actually seeing is the predictable response to state violence that a portion of the population will resist when the state abandons constitutional limits, which is exactly what authoritarian regimes want, because it gives them the pretext for even more repression. Let me be absolutely crystal clear about what those images represent in the longer arc of American history, because when federal agents are chasing American citizens through the streets, when they're yanking women from cars as they scream about their citizenship, when masked U.S. immigration and customs enforcement agents across the country are conducting arrests without promptly identifying and without visible identification, and the failure of ICE officers to promptly identify themselves during arrests as required by federal regulations undermines public trust in law enforcement and endangers the safety and rights of individuals and communities. You are watching the deliberate construction of a paramilitary force operating outside normal law enforcement constraints, and when reports of abuse and possible misconduct during federal immigration enforcement operations have been widespread, including serious allegations against ICE and CBP officers, and the Trump administration is lying, including under oath about possible misconduct among federal immigration enforcement activities, and oversight Democrats are demanding DHS investigate each incident. The pattern is unmistakable. This is not law enforcement. This is state terror deployed against communities of color to create the conditions for a white ethno-nationalist political order. And here is the economic dimension that connects this to the broader project of right-wing authoritarian consolidation, because Trump's assault on immigrant communities has continued with an unprecedented number of ICE raids forcing families to stay home out of fear of being picked up, and people aren't going to doctor's appointments, and when immigration raids happen, they aren't sending their kids to school, and communities like heavily immigrant-populated Boyle Heights in Los Angeles are experiencing economic fallout as shoppers stay home and street vendors and local businesses lose customers, which means the raids are functioning as economic warfare against working-class communities and small businesses, while assistance from Congress, in the form of $170.1 billion in new spending for immigration enforcement, signed into law July 4, 2025, will turbocharge the Trump administration's effort, and this new infusion makes ICE the highest-funded federal law enforcement agency in history, funded at a level higher than some foreign military. So you have the largest domestic law enforcement mobilization in American history, targeting people who overwhelmingly have no criminal records funded at military scale, operating with deliberate constitutional violations, and you want to tell me this is about border security. This is about the construction of a domestic counterinsurgency apparatus that can be deployed against any population the regime designates as enemies. Look at what the administration itself celebrates as success, because the mask isn't just slipping, it's completely off when DHS boasts about driving the first decline in the foreign-born U.S. population in more than 50 years, and thanks to aggressive enforcement, streamlined deportation protocols, and restoration of real border security, hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens have been deported, and over 2 million more have self-deported. Rather than face certain removal, they are explicitly celebrating ethnic demographic engineering. They are celebrating terrorizing millions of people into fleeing their homes, and when the DHS Assistant Secretary says the era of mass illegal migration, open borders, and visa abuse is over, and the American people finally have a government that enforces the law, not one that apologizes for it. What they mean is the era of constitutional constraints on state power is over. What they mean is the era of treating brown people as fully human with rights is over, and they're saying it out loud because they believe correctly that a sufficient portion of the white American population will accept or even celebrate this violence as long as it's directed at the right targets. Here's where resistance becomes not just morally necessary, but existentially imperative, and I want you to understand that people are already fighting back in ways that should inspire all of us, because Trump's raids are turning into a slog met with 1,000 cuts of small-town rebellions, and this is hardly the passive or supportive response that hardliners in Washington might have expected from red state USA. As in Appalachia and the Southeast, everyday Americans are standing up to ICE arresting their immigrants, are standing up to ICE arresting their immigrants, are standing up to neighbors. And in Harlan County, Kentucky, a storied epicenter of Appalachian labor wars, residents got an alarming preview when a convoy of black SUVs rolled into town, and armed agents in tactical gear stormed 2 Mexican restaurants, and at first the operation was framed as a drug bust, but despite being carried out by DEA agents, it was an immigration raid, which reveals the extent to which the administration is using every federal agency as an immigration enforcement arm, and when everyday community members, teachers, parents, clergy have adapted lessons from other cities as they look for ways to support migrant neighbors, and on the first school day after immigration agents flooded Charlotte, a teacher reported that only 5 of his students showed up for class. We are watching in real time the emergence of a broad-based multiracial working-class resistance movement, and this terrifies the regime more than anything else, because it reveals that their project of dividing the working class along racial lines is not inevitable. It can be fought, it can be defeated. The infrastructure of resistance is already being built, and it's beautiful, and it's radical, and it demonstrates what solidarity looks like in practice when Union del Barrio began holding Know Your Rights workshops and conducting patrols to alert community members to ICE presence during Trump's first administration. and their ICE Watch program became something of a model for similar groups around the country, which have popped up in nearly every large city and many smaller municipalities over the past few years. A crowdsourced text-based alert system called StopIce.net had roughly 9,000 subscribers, mostly around Southern California in early May, but by mid-June, after massive protests, more than 270,000 people from all over the country had signed up for notification that you are watching the construction of a parallel information and mutual aid network that operates outside state surveillance and control, which is exactly what resistance to authoritarian regimes requires. And when Chicago religious leaders from several faiths formed a coalition called Faith Over Fear to respond to ICE raids and support congregations through interfaith prayer services and Know Your Rights training, we are seeing the moral communities of this country recognize their obligation to protect the vulnerable, which is the necessary foundation for any successful resistance movement. Let me bring this to the question of what these images mean for the future of American democracy, because we are at an inflection point, and the choice is binary, and it is urgent when the Trump administration has turned immigration enforcement into a weapon of fear, and it is long past time for Congress to put an end to this terror. And in Minneapolis, this administration has sent ICE to target Somalis with clear intent to intimidate and destabilize the community, and we cannot normalize raids, indefinite detention, and deportations without due process in place of policy. And when 70% of voters, including a majority of Republicans, oppose ICE restraining children with zip ties during raids, and voters oppose ICE roughly throwing protesters on the ground and conducting deportation raids in the middle of the night, there is a popular mandate for ending this barbarism. The political will exists. The question is whether we can organize it into effective resistance before the administration consolidates enough power to make resistance impossible. Those women screaming as federal agents chase them as they're ripped from vehicles, as they plead that their citizens are showing us in the most visceral way possible what the stakes actually are. And when DHS responds not with accountability but with defiance, not with reform but with expansion, not with constitutional compliance but with explicitly unconstitutional policies, you need to understand that this is the test case. This is how they're determining how much violence the American public will tolerate against racialized others before they extend the same tactics to every population that resists their agenda. And the historical pattern is crystal clear. Every authoritarian regime starts by dehumanizing and terrorizing a vulnerable minority, and then expands the circle of violence outward until no one is safe. And if you think your citizenship will protect you when they come for you, remember that over a dozen U.S. citizens have already been swept up in this crackdown. Remember that 23-year-old American woman running in terror from federal agents. Remember that your papers, your skin color, your accent, your neighborhood could put you in their sights next, because the logic of fascism is limitless expansion. It never stops at the first target. It never says we've gone far enough. It always demands more blood, more deportations, more raids, more terror, until it is stopped by force, by organizing, by resistance, by people who refuse to be complicit in atrocity. What you just watched is not an immigration policy. It is the opening act of American fascism, and every single one of us has a choice to make right now. Whether we will be complicit through our silence, whether we will resist through our organizing, whether we will protect our neighbors, or whether we will avert our eyes and pretend this isn't happening, because I promise you, history will judge us by what we do in this moment, and the women screaming in those videos will never forget, and their children will never forget, and the millions of people living in terror right now will never forget who stood with them and who looked away. And when this is over, when we're accounting for what happened in America in 2025, you will have to answer for what you did when you saw those images, when you heard those screams, when you watched federal agents hunt human beings through America's streets. And you need to ask yourself right now, before another day passes, what are you going to do? Because doing nothing is a choice, and it's the choice that enables every atrocity that follows.